Marcus Holloway had driven that Honda for 6 years. He had worn the same watch his grandfather gave him. He had smiled through every joke about his budget lifestyle. And now, standing in the foyer of his grandmother's estate, watching his mother-in-law's face fall, he felt nothing at all. The morning of that Christmas party started like any other winter morning in Marcus Holloway's life. Quiet, measured, intentional. He sat in the small office at the back of his modest 4-bedroom house, the kind of house that looked comfortable but not excessive, the kind of house that made people assume things about the man who lived there. On his desk sat 3 monitors displaying spreadsheets, investment portfolios, and quarterly reports that would have made most people's eyes glaze over. But Marcus understood every number, every decimal point, every implication. This was his work, had been for 15 years. Managing wealth that nobody in his wife's family knew existed. Denise appeared in the doorway, wearing a red dress that caught the winter light coming through the window. She was 35 years old, beautiful in that effortless way that made Marcus's chest tighten even after 8 years of marriage. Her smile was nervous, though. It always got that way before they visited her family. She asked if he was almost ready, and mentioned that her mother wanted them there by 4 to help set up. Marcus nodded without looking away from his screen. He told her he just needed to finish one thing, and then he would shower. Denise lingered for a moment, like she wanted to say something else, but then she disappeared back down the hallway. Marcus knew what she had wanted to say. She wanted to ask if he was sure about driving the Honda. She wanted to suggest, gently, the way she always did, that maybe they could rent something nicer just for the night, just so her family wouldn't have anything to comment on. But she didn't ask, and he was grateful for that small mercy. The truth was, Marcus Holloway could have driven anything he wanted to that party. He could have pulled up in a Bentley Continental, the one sitting in a garage 20 miles away, the one he drove maybe twice a year, when his grandmother insisted on being taken to church in style. He could have worn the Patek Philippe that sat in a safety deposit box instead of the modest Seiko his grandfather had given him when he graduated from Howard. He could have done a lot of things differently over the past 8 years. But Marcus had learned something important from his grandmother a long time ago. He learned that the people who need to show you what they have usually don't have much else to offer. So he drove the Honda. He wore the Seiko, and he let Denise's family believe whatever story made them comfortable. 8 years earlier, on a spring afternoon that smelled like magnolias and possibility, Marcus Holloway married Denise Ashford in a small ceremony at a community church in Southeast Washington. There were 47 guests, a local caterer, flowers from a family friend who owned a nursery. It was intimate and warm, and exactly what Marcus had wanted. What he hadn't wanted was the look on Lorraine Ashford's face when she surveyed the reception hall. His mother-in-law had the kind of disappointment that didn't need words. It lived in the corners of her mouth, in the way she touched things, like she was checking for dust. Lorraine pulled Denise aside during the cake cutting. Marcus wasn't supposed to hear, but sound carried in that small hall. Lorraine whispered that it was a lovely ceremony, and that it was fine. Then she added that she just hoped Denise was sure about this because there was still time to make different choices. She mentioned a young doctor named Franklin who had been asking about Denise at church and said he came from people with vision. Denise told her mother to stop. She said Marcus was a good man. Lorraine responded that she never said he wasn't good and that she just hoped good would be enough. Marcus heard all of it. He pretended he hadn't. He cut the cake with his new wife and smiled for photographs and danced with his grandmother to a Stevie Wonder song while Lorraine Ashford watched from a table in the corner, already calculating what this marriage would cost her daughter in status. That was the first cut. Marcus didn't bleed. He just noted where the knife had landed and kept moving. The second year of the marriage brought the first emergency. Carlton Ashford, Denise's father, called one evening in October, with his voice carrying that particular weight that men use when they're about to ask for something they don't want to ask for. He explained there had been some unexpected medical expenses and that he hated to even bring it up, but they were $15,000 short. He told Denise he would pay it back in 6 months. Denise told Marcus about it that night in bed. Her voice was small and embarrassed, and Marcus could see how much it cost her to even repeat the request. He didn't hesitate. He told her to send it and that family helps family. Denise cried a little and told him thank you, that she knew her family could be difficult, and that it meant everything. 6 months passed, then a year. The money was never mentioned again. No repayment, no acknowledgement. Just silence, as if the $15,000 had evaporated into the same air that carried Lorraine's sighs of disappointment. The 3rd year brought Brandon's first business venture. Denise's younger brother had what their mother called an entrepreneurial spirit, and what Marcus privately recognized as a complete absence of financial literacy. Brandon wanted to open a sneaker resale shop in a gentrifying neighborhood. He needed investors. Lorraine called Denise to explain that the family was pooling resources and asked if maybe Marcus could contribute to his brother-in-law's future. Marcus sent $25,000. The store closed in 8 months. Brandon blamed the location, the economy, the landlord, everything except his own lack of planning. The money disappeared. No repayment, no acknowledgement. The 4th year was the roof. The 5th year was Tiffany's wedding, which went over budget and required a last-minute infusion of cash that Lorraine swore would be returned promptly. The 6th year was Carlton's retirement party, which somehow required Marcus to cover the venue rental. The 7th year was Brandon's second business, a cryptocurrency consulting firm that lasted 4 months and consumed $30,000 before collapsing under the weight of its own absurdity. Marcus kept a ledger, not because he expected repayment, but because he believed in accuracy. By the 8th year of his marriage, that ledger showed $187,400 given to the Ashford family. Given, not loaned, because loans implied an expectation of return. There was no expectation here, just quiet generosity from a man they believed had nothing, and therefore gave beyond his means out of desperation to belong. The Ashfords never saw it that way, of course. To them, Marcus's contributions were proof that he knew his place. He was buying access to their family, purchasing proximity to the life Denise deserved but had foolishly abandoned when she married beneath her. Every check was accepted as tribute. Every dinner, Marcus sat through, smiling politely, while Tiffany's surgeon husband talked about his practice, and Brandon explained his latest scheme, and Lorraine asked Denise pointed questions about whether she was happy, really happy. Every holiday where Marcus's Honda sat in the driveway like an apology, while Carlton's leased Mercedes gleamed beside it. Marcus absorbed all of it. The comments about his clothes, the questions about his career that always seemed designed to expose rather than understand. The way Lorraine introduced him to her friends, if she introduced him at all, as Denise's husband. Never by name, never with pride. 8 years of small cuts. 8 years of blood he never let anyone see. And through it all, Denise loved him. That was what mattered. She loved him for who he was, not for what he could give her. At least, that's what Marcus told himself. That's what made the silence bearable. 3 weeks before that Christmas party, Marcus was working late in his home office when he heard Denise on the phone in the kitchen. Her voice carried that particular tension it always held when she talked to her mother. Marcus wasn't trying to listen, but the house was quiet and sound traveled. Lorraine was explaining that the property taxes had come due, and that she hadn't expected them to be so high this year. She hated to ask, but she wondered if Denise could talk to Marcus about helping with $8,000. Marcus heard his wife's hesitation, heard the soft sigh she tried to hide, heard her promise to ask and call back tomorrow. Then she hung up and stood alone in the kitchen for a long moment before coming to tell him about the request. He agreed without protest. He always did. But something sat differently this time. Something he couldn't name but could feel, like a thread pulled loose in a sweater that hadn't unraveled yet. 2 weeks later, that thread pulled tighter. Marcus was scrolling through his phone during lunch when he saw Tiffany's Instagram post. The photo showed Lorraine and Carlton on the deck of a cruise ship, drinks in hand, the Caribbean sun turning their smiles golden. The caption read, "Third trip this year. Mom and Dad know how to live." Marcus stared at that photo for a long time. He read the caption twice. "Third trip this year. Property taxes came due. $8,000. Third trip this year." He didn't say anything to Denise. He didn't confront anyone. He just noted the irregularity and kept moving. But something had shifted. Some small mechanism in his chest had begun to turn. 1 week before the party, Marcus experienced the moment that would change everything. He was at Denise's parents' house for a pre-holiday gathering, a casual dinner that required his presence, but not his participation. He stepped outside to take a call from his grandmother's estate manager about a maintenance issue, and when he came back inside, he paused in the hallway outside the kitchen. Brandon and Tiffany were talking. Their voices were low, but not low enough. Tiffany was saying that Mom's strategy was working perfectly, and that she kept Denise believing they were struggling, while Marcus just kept writing checks. She laughed. Brandon agreed, and said the best part was that Marcus was too proud to check. He said the man thought he was helping family, when really he was just paying rent for the privilege of being tolerated. Marcus stood in that hallway for 15 seconds, maybe 20. His face revealed nothing. His breathing stayed even. Then he walked back into the gathering and sat beside his wife and smiled at a joke Carlton made about the football game, and ate dinner, and drove home, and kissed Denise goodnight, and lay awake until 3 in the morning staring at the ceiling. The next day, he called Cedric Tate. Cedric had been Marcus's friend since their freshman year at Howard. They'd pledged the same fraternity, studied for the same exams, stood in each other's weddings. Cedric was an attorney now, specializing in estate law and family trusts, and he was one of the only people outside of Marcus's blood relatives who knew the full extent of the Holloway family's holdings. When Marcus called and asked if they could meet, Cedric didn't ask why. He just named a time and place and showed up. They sat in Cedric's office, 2 men approaching 40, surrounded by leather-bound books and diplomas and the quiet weight of decisions that shaped lives. Marcus explained what he had heard, what he suspected, what he needed to know. Cedric asked if Marcus was sure he wanted to go down this road. He pointed out that some doors, once opened, couldn't be closed again. Marcus responded that the door was already open and that he was just trying to see what was on the other side. So they looked, together, carefully. It didn't take long to find the truth. Public records painted a picture very different from the one the Ashfords had been selling for 8 years. Carlton's retirement portfolio, accessible through a combination of legal databases and financial disclosures from his time at the bank, showed holdings worth just over $1.2 million. Not wealthy by any extreme standard, but comfortable. More than comfortable. Certainly not struggling. Brandon's failed businesses, the ones that had supposedly drained family resources and required outside investment, had actually been funded entirely by Lorraine through a series of transfers from accounts that Carlton had been growing for years. No outside investors, no community pooling of resources. Just Lorraine feeding her son's delusions while telling Denise the family needed help. But the discovery that made Cedric lean back in his chair and let out a low whistle was the estate. The Christmas party location that Lorraine had been describing for weeks as belonging to a dear friend who was generous enough to let them use it for the holiday. Cedric pulled up the property records and turned his screen toward Marcus. The estate belonged to the Holloway family trust. It had been in Marcus's family for 3 generations. His grandmother Eleanor had purchased it in 1987 with proceeds from the logistics empire Marcus's grandfather had built. The Ashfords had rented it through a property management company for $15,000, never knowing whose name was on the deed. Marcus sat with that information for a long moment. The irony was almost too perfect to process. The family that had spent 8 years making him feel small, questioning his worth, dismissing his presence. They were throwing their grand Christmas party in his house, paying rent to his grandmother, performing their wealth in a space that belonged to the people they had spent nearly a decade looking down upon. Cedric asked what Marcus wanted to do with this information. Marcus didn't answer right away. He just stared at the property records, at the clean lines of legal documentation that told a story no one had ever bothered to ask him about. Finally, he said that he wanted to see his grandmother. Eleanor Holloway was 84 years old and carried herself like a woman who had earned every single year. She'd grown up in rural Georgia, the daughter of sharecroppers, and had worked her way through a teaching degree before marrying Raymond Holloway, a man with a talent for seeing opportunities where others saw obstacles. Together, they had built a logistics company that now operated in 12 states. When Raymond died in 2015, Eleanor stepped back from active management and passed the responsibility to her grandson, the quiet boy who had always preferred numbers to noise. Marcus found her in the sunroom of the estate's main house, the same sunroom where the Ashfords would be hosting their Christmas party in 1 week. She was reading a novel and drinking tea, and when she saw her grandson, her face softened in that way it only did for him. He sat across from her and told her everything. The 8 years of disrespect, the money he had given, the conversations he had overheard. And now this, the discovery that his wife's family had unknowingly rented his own grandmother's home to perform a version of success they had never actually earned. Eleanor listened without interrupting. When he finished, she set down her teacup and looked at him with eyes that had seen far too much of human nature to be surprised by any of it. She told him that when she was younger, she used to think that proving people wrong was the goal. She said she thought that if she just worked hard enough, succeeded loudly enough, the folks who doubted her would have to admit they were wrong. Then she learned something. She said those people were never going to admit anything, because admitting they were wrong would mean rethinking everything they believed about who deserved what. She said some people would rather keep believing comfortable lies than sit with uncomfortable truths. She asked him what he wanted from this situation, not what he thought he should want, or what would feel satisfying in the moment, but what he actually wanted. Marcus thought about it. He said he wanted Denise to see them clearly. He said he wanted her to understand what they had been doing, who they had been showing her he was. He said he didn't want revenge, but he wanted truth. Eleanor nodded slowly. She told him that sometimes truth is the only revenge that lasts. Then she said something that would stay with him for the rest of his life. She said sometimes people need to stand in your house before they can see who you are. The afternoon of the Christmas party arrived wrapped in cold sunlight and the kind of anticipation that sits heavy in the chest. Denise spent 2 hours getting ready, her nervousness manifesting in the way she changed earrings 3 times and asked Marcus how she looked 4 times, and finally stood by the front door in her elegant green dress, looking like she was preparing for battle rather than celebration. Marcus wore a charcoal suit that was well made, but not ostentatious. His grandfather's Seiko, his wedding ring, nothing else. He helped Denise into her coat and grabbed his keys, the same keys that started the same Honda that had been the subject of so many jokes, and they drove through the winter afternoon toward a destination his wife didn't know belonged to him. The estate looked magnificent in the early evening light. 15 acres of manicured grounds, a Georgian-style main house that dated back to 1952. Gardens that would bloom spectacular in spring, but now lay dormant under a thin layer of frost. Cars lined the circular driveway, luxury vehicles gleaming under the decorative lights. Lorraine had no doubt personally selected. Marcus parked the Honda at the end of the row. A young man in a valet uniform approached, but Marcus waved him off with a small smile. The young man nodded with a deference that Denise didn't notice, but Marcus understood. Inside, the party was already in full swing. 40 or 50 guests moved through rooms decorated with professional precision, the kind of Christmas elegance that required a budget and a vision, and the complete absence of financial struggle. Lorraine stood near the grand fireplace, holding court in a cream-colored dress, accepting compliments on her taste, her planning, her ability to bring people together. She spotted Marcus and Denise and made her way over with Carlton trailing behind. Her smile was the kind that showed teeth, but not warmth. She said they made it, and that she was starting to worry. She made a comment about seeing the car outside and hoped nothing was wrong with it. Carlton chuckled at the comment. Denise tensed beside Marcus, but he just smiled and said it ran fine, and that it always did. The party continued. Marcus moved through it like a ghost who had been granted temporary visibility. He shook hands with people whose names he would forget. He accepted the same backhanded compliments he had been accepting for years. He watched Brandon hold court near the bar, explaining his latest business idea to anyone who would listen. He watched Tiffany show off photos from a recent vacation while her surgeon husband nodded along absently. And he watched the staff, the caterers and servers and housekeeping personnel who moved through the party with professional invisibility. They all knew him, had known him since he was a teenager, spending summers at his grandmother's estate. But they understood discretion. They called him Sir when they passed and met his eyes with the slightest nods of recognition. The moment came at 7:43. Marcus would remember the time because he had glanced at his grandfather's Seiko just seconds before, wondering how much longer he would need to wait. Raymond Osei, who had managed the Holloway estate for 31 years, approached Marcus near the main foyer. Raymond was 62 years old, dignified in the way of men who understood that service was not servitude. He had watched Marcus grow from a quiet child into a quiet man, and he knew better than most what this evening meant. Raymond spoke clearly, his voice pitched to carry just enough without shouting. "Welcome home, Mr. Holloway. Should we bring the Bentley around front, or will you be staying in the guest house tonight?" The words landed like stones dropped into still water. The ripples spread outward, catching Lorraine first. Her face went through a transformation that would have been fascinating to study if Marcus had been interested in studying it. Confusion, processing, disbelief, and then something colder, the expression of a woman watching a foundation crack beneath her feet. She was close enough to hear. So were Carlton, Tiffany, Brandon, and at least a dozen of their guests. The room didn't go silent all at once, but conversations died in clusters as people registered that something significant was happening. Lorraine asked what he just said. Her voice had lost its party warmth. Marcus turned to face his mother-in-law. His expression was calm. His voice was even. "Raymond has worked for my family since I was 8 years old. This is my grandmother's estate. You've been renting it from us for the past week." The silence that followed was thick enough to touch. Carlton's mouth opened and closed like a man searching for words in a language he had suddenly forgotten. Brandon's confident posture crumbled into something smaller. Tiffany reached for her husband's arm, as if she needed physical support to remain standing. But Marcus wasn't watching them. He was watching Denise. His wife stood 3 feet away, her beautiful face cycling through emotions he had never seen her show. Confusion became surprise, became the slow, terrible dawn of understanding. Lorraine tried to recover. She was good at recovery, had built a life on the ability to pivot when situations turned against her. She told Marcus that was wonderful. She said she had no idea, and that they always knew he had potential, and that why hadn't he said something? Marcus met her eyes. No, you didn't. You didn't know I had potential. You spent 8 years telling my wife she'd settled. You spent 8 years taking money we gave freely while telling your children we weren't good enough to acknowledge. He pulled out his phone, opened a folder Cedric had helped him prepare, and handed it to Denise. These are emails between your parents. 8 years of discussions about how to keep you financially tied to them. Plans to eventually convince you that you'd made a mistake marrying me. They called the money I gave them tribute, Denise. They laughed about it. Denise read in silence. Her hands trembled slightly. The room watched, collectively holding its breath, as a wife discovered that her family had been weaponizing her marriage. When she looked up, there were no tears, just a clarity that Marcus had never seen in her before. She turned to her mother. You had me believing my husband wasn't enough. For 8 years, I apologized to you for him. I made excuses for him. I loved him anyway, but I let you make me feel like that love was a compromise. She paused, her voice steadied. He was carrying all of us, Mama. Every emergency you manufactured, every business Brandon failed, every party you needed help funding, and you took it while looking down on him. She took Marcus's hand. It was a small gesture, but it said everything. Denise told Lorraine to have a nice Christmas. Then the Holloways walked through the foyer of their own estate and out into the cold December night. They drove home in silence. Not uncomfortable silence, but the kind that exists between two people who have just witnessed something that requires time to process. Denise stared out the window at passing lights, while Marcus guided the Honda through quiet streets. When they got home, Denise finally spoke. She said she didn't know. Her voice was thick with something between grief and anger. She said she didn't know any of it, and that she thought they were struggling. She thought he was helping because he was kind, and that she never imagined they were taking advantage of it. Marcus told her he knew she didn't know, and that was why he never blamed her for any of it. She turned to look at him, really look at him, as if seeing him for the first time. She asked why he never told her about his family and about the wealth. She asked why he let her believe they were just comfortable. Marcus was quiet for a moment, choosing his words carefully. Because I needed to know you chose me, not what I came from, not what I could provide, just me, the man in the Honda with the old watch and the simple life. She started to cry then, not dramatic sobs, but the quiet tears of someone whose entire understanding of their life was being reorganized. She told him she was sorry. She said she was sorry for every time she suggested he dress differently, or drive something else, or try harder to impress them. She said she was sorry for not seeing what was right in front of her. Marcus pulled her close. He told her that none of that mattered now. The weeks that followed the Christmas party brought changes that arrived without drama, but with the steady inevitability of consequences long delayed. The Ashford family's carefully constructed image began to erode, not because Marcus sought revenge, but because truth has a way of spreading once it escapes containment. Guests who had witnessed the revelation talked. They talked at other parties, at church, at business lunches. The story grew in the telling, as stories do, but the core remained constant. The family that had positioned themselves as generous hosts and successful people had been renting someone else's estate and spending years manipulating their own daughter's marriage. Lorraine's position on the boards of 2 local charities became untenable. She wasn't asked to resign explicitly, but invitations to meetings stopped arriving, and her calls went unreturned until she got the message. Carlton's golf buddies, men he had cultivated for years, with carefully projected images of success, began declining his invitations. The whispers followed him through clubhouses and parking lots. Brandon's newest business venture, a personal styling service for executives that he had been preparing to launch with money he assumed would come through Denise, collapsed before it began. Without access to the Holloway resources he had never earned, he found himself facing something he had avoided his entire adult life: the need to work for someone else. Tiffany's surgeon husband quietly suggested they distance themselves from her family for a while. Professional reputation mattered in his circles, and association with the Ashfords had become more liability than asset. Tiffany didn't argue. She was too busy reckoning with her own complicity in years of cruelty toward a man who had never responded in kind. Marcus watched none of this with satisfaction. He wasn't interested in watching people suffer, even people who had caused him pain. He simply continued living his life, managing his grandmother's holdings, loving his wife, building something that would outlast any temporary humiliation. In February, he established the Eleanor Holloway Foundation. Named for his grandmother, the foundation would provide scholarships to first-generation college students from modest backgrounds, young people who reminded Marcus of who his grandmother had been before circumstances changed her family's trajectory. The announcement event was held at the estate, the same rooms where the Christmas party had unraveled, now filled with educators and community leaders and young people whose eyes shone with possibility. The Ashfords were not invited. Marcus didn't make a point of excluding them. He simply didn't think about them when creating the guest list. They had become what they perhaps always should have been: people from his wife's past who had chosen not to be part of his present. 6 months after that Christmas party, on a warm June afternoon, Marcus and Denise moved into the guest house on his grandmother's estate. Not the main house, which had too many rooms for 2 people, but a smaller structure that offered privacy and space and the particular peace of being surrounded by land that had been in his family for decades. Denise had taken time to understand the full scope of what her husband had kept hidden: the wealth, which was substantial; the responsibility, which was greater than she had imagined; the choice he had made years ago to present himself simply because he wanted to be loved simply. At first she felt foolish for not seeing it. Then she felt angry at her family for making her believe she had settled. Finally, she felt something like awe for the man who had endured so much disrespect without ever using his resources as a weapon. She apologized to him one evening as they sat on their new porch watching the sun set over the gardens. She said she spent years being embarrassed by a man who never gave her a single reason for shame. She said she defended him to her family while secretly wishing he would prove himself. She didn't realize he had already proven everything that mattered. Marcus took her hand. He told her she didn't know because he didn't let her know. He said that was his choice and his burden. He said she loved him when she thought he had nothing, and that was the only proof he ever needed. Their marriage, tested by revelation and upheaval, emerged stronger than it had been before. Truth will do that. It burns away the weak parts and leaves behind only what can survive the fire. Lorraine called in March. Her voice on Denise's voicemail was smaller than it had ever been, aged somehow, as if the past months had cost her more than just social standing. She asked if they could talk, said she wanted to move past everything, said that family was family, no matter what. Denise called her back that evening. The conversation was brief. Denise said that moving past required accountability first. She told her mother to call back when she was ready for that conversation. Then she hung up. Not with anger, not with cruelty. Just with the clarity of a woman who had finally learned to distinguish between family obligation and family manipulation. Eleanor Holloway passed away in September, 3 months after Denise and Marcus moved to the estate. She went peacefully in her sleep, in the house her husband had bought for her 40 years earlier. The funeral was small and private, attended by people who had actually known her, rather than people who wanted to be seen knowing her. Marcus delivered the eulogy. He spoke about a woman who had taught him that worth wasn't something you displayed, it was something you lived. He spoke about lessons learned on summer afternoons, about values passed down through generations, about the particular courage required to succeed without losing yourself in the success. He didn't cry during the service. Eleanor wouldn't have wanted that. She had always been impatient with excessive emotion, believing that grief was best expressed through continuation, through living the lessons the departed had taught. A week after the funeral, Marcus drove to the small cemetery where Eleanor had been laid to rest beside her husband. He stood at her headstone for a long time, watching autumn leaves drift across the manicured grass. He told her, "Thank you. Not for the money, or the estate, or the opportunities. Thank you for teaching him that silence could be strength, that restraint could be power, that the people who needed to diminish others to feel large were usually the smallest people in any room." He told her he hoped he had made her proud. The wind stirred the leaves at his feet, and for a moment he could almost hear her voice. The same voice that had read him stories as a child and quizzed him on arithmetic and held him when his parents died in a car accident when he was 17. The voice that had shaped him into the man he had become. He drove home in the Honda, past the main house where staff were preparing for winter, past the gardens where his grandmother had spent so many peaceful hours, down the long driveway lined with trees his grandfather had planted half a century ago. The Bentley still sat in the garage. He would probably drive it someday, maybe to some event where appearances mattered, where showing up a certain way served a strategic purpose. But not today. Today the Honda felt right. It had always felt right. Marcus Holloway had spent 8 years being underestimated by people who should have seen him clearly. He had given money he didn't have to give, according to their understanding, and received only contempt in return. He had loved his wife fully while her family tried to convince her she deserved better. He had stood in rooms where his presence was tolerated rather than welcomed, and never once raised his voice in his own defense. And when the truth finally came out, when the moment arrived to show them exactly who they had been dismissing all those years, he didn't gloat, he didn't rage, he didn't craft elaborate revenge or savor their humiliation. He just kept being who he always was. A quiet man with a good heart and more resources than anyone imagined, choosing simplicity not because he had to, but because he understood something most people never learn. The size of your life isn't measured by what you show the world. It's measured by what you do when no one's watching. I'll see you in the next one.